All right. Now, I realized that this particular conference, we might have a bigger Hollywood presence at this conference than we ever had. And what I mean by that is, speakers that are on television or have shows or associated with movies. Like a lot of these folks are on TV with some regularity, but we have an extraordinarily large number of them here that are directly involved in a lot of the productions and stuff, which is very, very cool. So it's our celebrity special conference this year. Our next speaker is paramount to this idea, and that's why I mention it. He's the author of more than 40 books on UFOs, lake monsters, zombies, and Hollywood scandal, including the Roswell UFO Conspiracy, Women in Black, Men in Black, and 365 Days of UFOs. He's appeared on many TV shows, including BBC's Out of This World, Sci-Fi Channel's Proof Positive, the History Channel's Monster Quest, America's Book of Secrets and UFO Hunters, and National Geographic Channel's Paranatural. And the NSNBC Countdown to Keith Olbermann. He lives in Arlington, Texas. Did I offend you with my comments about Lone Star beer? Yeah, sorry. I do have my opinions on some things. Beer is one of them. I am so excited to hear him speak today because the subject he's going to talk on has not been presented at this conference for a very, very long time, if ever. I don't know, specifically. It's a part of the UFO phenomenon that's been around for forever, and so you get to hear information you probably have never heard before. So in his presentation, he's going to be talking about the Men in Black phenomenon, which began basically in the 1940s, and how it continues to this day, which you don't hear that much about this particular aspect of it today, so this is going to be very good. He will also discuss how the real reports inspired the hugely successful movie Men in Black, starring Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. How many of you have that movie on your, if you're changing channels and you see it, you have to stop and watch the rest of it? Yeah. He will discuss the theories that have been put forward for the origins of the Men in Black. Are they government agents, time travelers, aliens, paranormal creatures, or ET human hybrids? So join me in welcoming Nick Redfern.
Thanks, man. Thanks. Well, thanks, everybody. Was that all for me, all that applause? Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you. And I really do live in Arlington. I just don't sound like I come from Arlington. So. But hopefully that won't be any problem with the lecture. And before we get to the actual lecture itself, I thought I'd just sort of give you a bit of background as to how I got involved and interested in the UFO subject. I guess I'm one of those people who has a deep interest in the subject, but I've never actually seen a UFO. But how and why I got involved and interested is that my dad was in the British Royal Air Force. He worked as a radar mechanic. And he was involved in several UFO incidents in the early 1950s, actually during a NATO operation called Exercise Mainbrace. And there were a lot of UFO encounters reported throughout Mainbrace. And on one occasion, a fleet, or a squadron, if you like, of UFOs was seen approaching the English coastline. And the first thought was, because this was the height of the Cold War, it's got to be the Russians. So military aircraft were sent up to intercept them. Instead of seeing Russian fighter planes or bombers, they saw these sort of classic circular flying saucers. Some of the other pilots reported seeing strange lights in the sky. This went on for 3 nights, and as a radar mechanic, my dad was brought in to check out all the equipment to make sure there weren't any malfunctions with the radar system. And it turns out there wasn't. And of course, there was the visual sightings from the pilots. And from there, the next day, when the incidents came to a halt and were not repeated, everybody was taken into a room, the pilots, the ground crews, the radar operators, the radar mechanics like my dad, and everybody was told, you won't talk about this is a national security issue. And my dad didn't tell anybody. He told me when I was about 12. And it really got me interested because I was thinking, if government agencies say don't talk about this, and something they don't want us to know about, it probably is something that we should know about, you know. So I certainly wasn't sort of running around at 12 years old investigating UFOs like some sort of precocious little kid or whatever, you know. But I did have an interest, and I started reading books by people like John Keel and Brad Steiger and people like that. And then when I finished school, I began working on a music magazine back in England and did that for a few years. And I still do quite a bit of that now. And but from there, I thought, well, why not try and combine the background in journalism with investigating strange phenomena, but take like a journalistic approach to it, which I think is the best way to do it. And the Men in Black mystery is one of the ones that interests me probably most of all. And I've written 5 books on the subject. The 5th one comes out in June. And what I've found, and I think like most authors, if you write a book, you get feedback from the readers. And so I get a lot of stories on the Men in Black. But there's a lot of sort of misperceptions about who or what the Men in Black are. I mean, if you ask the general public, the Men in Black are Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, you know. And even for a lot of people in ufology, you know, who are new to the subject when the movies came out, that imagery of the Men in Black being government agents from some sort of super secret group that even the elected government didn't know about, that was kind of the angle that we have with the Men in Black. But when you dig deeper into it, you find it's far weirder and much stranger than just some sort of group in the government silencing people. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we go along, and particularly in the section of the lecture where I'll be talking about the different theories that have been put forward for what the Men in Black might be. Now, you'll see from the lecture title that it also involves women in black. And funnily enough, a lot of my old girlfriends were women in black, but they were goths. But that's a different type. That's a totally different type of women in black, as far as I know, anyway. So. But joking aside, we have the Men in Black, we have the women in black, and there's sort of a subcategories where different phenomena seem kind of connected to the Men in Black, like the black-eyed children that some of you may have heard of, the shadow people, the Hat Man, the Slender Man. They're all sort of noted for their black clothing and trying to get into people's homes and terrorize them. So I think it's not just one phenomenon, it's sort of something that goes all across the board. That's my third book on the subject, and I put that one on more than anything else just to sort of demonstrate to you what people describe. You've sort of got the old style fedora hat, the old black car, and they sort of lurk in the shadows until they sort of pounce and threaten people. And so that sort of gives you a visual image of what the Men in Black actually look like. Now, the big question is, you know, when did this whole phenomenon begin? Now, we know that 1947 was the year in which the whole UFO phenomenon kicked off with Kenneth Arnold's sighting at Mount Rainier on June the 24th, 1947. But if you go back further, you can actually find a number of cases which sound eerily like the Men in Black reports, but the term Men in Black was not, created until the early 1950s. So I think some of these earlier reports, people kind of passed them by, purely and simply because they just didn't feel there was, or understand that there was actually an existing phenomenon. It was just one of those weird things. To give you an example, in 1909 in Wales, UK, there was a wave of UFO activity where people reported in the little villages and towns in Wales, they reported seeing these strange lights in the sky, not like flying saucers, but sort of basketball-sized balls of light flitting through the little villages. And on one occasion, a man pulled up on like a black carriage with two black horses sitting on top of the coach, and he was wearing a long black cloak. And he pulled up outside the houses of various people in the villages and warned them not to talk about the strange balls of light that they saw. So in other words, what we have here is a very early example of Men in Black reports when cars weren't around. So instead, you have the black carriage, you have the black horses, but still the black outfit. So in other words, we can push the barriers back quite a long way when it comes to understanding exactly how long ago this phenomenon began. And again, so many people don't realize that this is a phenomenon that may go back not just to this case, 1909, but as far back as 300 or 400 years, as I'll get to later in the lecture. So what I think has happened is that over the years and centuries, we've seen these creatures or these entities have been with us all of that time, but they've really only come to our notice because of the term Men in Black. And it's sort of such an iconic term that everybody knows it, whether you're interested in UFOs or not. And because of that, we know about the subject, we visualize what the Men in Black look like, and for that reason, they're no longer hidden. Everybody knows about them. If anybody gets a knock on the door from a guy in a black suit after seeing a UFO, they instantly think Men in Black. So I think, in one sense, we've sort of blown their cover, which wasn't the case, at least, until the early 1950s, which brings us to the issue of how and under what circumstances the phenomenon began in the modern era. That's a book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, written by a guy named Gray Barker. And as you can see, the cover of the book has 3 men in black. Now, that book was published in 1956. The term Men in Black wasn't created then, but people were talking about, and certainly Barker talks in his book, about guys in black suit, men dressed in black, but the term itself wasn't around then. And basically, the book tells the story of a man named Albert Bender. Albert Bender is the one person more than anybody else who really kicked off the Men in Black phenomenon. And what happened was that Bender lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he lived with his father-in-law in this sort of creepy old house, which, if you've ever seen the movie Psycho with Norman Bates and his nutty mother, who's actually one and the same, they live in this sort of creepy old house on the hill. That was sort of the house that Albert Bender lived in, and of all places possible, he rented the attic. So, he lived in this creepy old house, this dark attic. And Albert Bender was very interested in sci-fi, in fantasy novels like H.P. Lovecraft, that kind of thing. But he was also deeply involved in the occult and the paranormal as well. He had a deep interest in demonology, the occult, ghosts, life after death, things like that. And then when the UFO phenomenon kicked off in 1947, he obviously moved into that arena as well. And Bender created a group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And the IFSB, most people today have probably not heard of it or forgotten about it, but for about 2 years in the early 1950s, it was actually one of the biggest UFO groups in the entire United States. And it had chapters in New Zealand, Australia, the UK, various parts of Europe and South America. And Bender spent all his spare time putting together his newsletter and mailing it off, etc., etc. And he was getting a lot of feedback on this phenomenon. And at the same time, his interest in the occult was growing as well. And he changed his attic room into what he called a chamber of horrors. And his plan was to charge people to come into the attic, where they would see skeletons hanging from the ceiling and ghouls and heads of werewolves on the wall, that kind of thing. And in his own, as he points out in his book himself, which I'll come to in a minute, one of the things he liked to do, if he'd invite a girlfriend over, he would throw rubber spiders at them, which I actually think it didn't get him a second date, but which doesn't surprise me really. But so Bender was into a lot of stuff. Some in the world of fiction, some in the world of reality, but all based around the supernatural. And everything was going well with the International Flying Saucer Bureau, and to the point where he was going to expand the group. But then suddenly he decided to close it down. And in the final issue of the IFSB journal, he said that he'd been told the truth of the UFO subject, but he'd been warned as well not to mention it to anybody else, and so he was backing away from the subject. Now, some people in ufology at the time thought this was sort of a publicity stunt, that he was going to go away and everybody would be thinking, what's going on with Bender? And then he would come back with another newsletter and everybody would want to buy it, you know. So there was that kind of cynicism, and it was sort of parallels, you know, if your favourite band announced that they're going to do their farewell tour, and so everybody goes and see them, and then what happens, like 5 years later, they come back, you know, and then everybody kind of feels cheated. But that happens all the time, and that's what people thought Bender was doing. But he actually wasn't. He left the subject and did not come back into it until 1962, and he very briefly came back to write a small book called Flying Saucers and the Three Men. The three men being the men in black that visited him. Now, Bender, as I said, just came back briefly to write that in 62, and then he did not come back to ufology at all. He just walked away from it. And he actually didn't die until 2016, and he was 94, which I guess is proof that just because you get threatened by the men in black, it doesn't mean you're going to die early, you know. But if you read Flying Saucers and the Three Men, it's a very strange book, but an interesting one, because it has as much to do with the paranormal as it does with ufology. Now, one of the things I've found over the years is that there are a lot of crossovers between the world of UFOs and the world of the paranormal. And a lot of people within ufology don't like that crossover. They like it just to be nuts and bolts UFOs and aliens from that star or that star. But the fact is, if you look at the data, there are these significant crossovers, which I'll mention in relation to the Men in Black. Now, what Bender actually said versus what people assumed are very different. The gossip and the grapevine, if you like, in ufology at the time thought that Bender had been visited by a representative of the FBI or the CIA or the Air Force dressed in a black suit and warning him not to talk about what he'd seen. But that wasn't the case. And it wasn't the fault of ufology, because Bender was quite closed-mouthed about it all until he went public in 62. And what he said was that one particular night, he was laying or sitting on his bed and he started to feel kind of weird, like lightheaded and sick, nauseous, and his head started to spin, and he lay down. As he lay down, he said he saw three sort of shadowy figures, not unlike those there, not knock on the front door, but literally sort of materialize through the walls in like a smoky fashion, like a black smoke, which then solidified into physical form. And he said the room was overwhelmed by this odor of like sulfur or brimstone, which you can find in numerous sort of paranormal phenomena throughout the world and throughout history. And in a telepathic fashion, they warned him to leave ufology behind or else. And then they vanished. And to start with, Bender was like, well, I'm not going to be intimidated by these people. And so he continued to do his research, continued to put out the journals, and so they came back again and again. And by the third occasion, Bender started to feel ill all the time. He started to get stomach problems. He started to get sort of pulverizing migraines. He would have these weird experiences when he would almost sort of pass out and have to lay down. He felt exhausted all the time. And it was almost from his perspective as if he'd been sort of supernaturally infected somehow. That's how he really felt, as if something had got his claws into him, so to speak. And that's really when he decided that enough is enough, and he walked away from it. And as I said, he just came back in 62 to write that book, and he spent much of the rest of his life actually sort of working, not so much working, but there's actually a guy named Max Steiner who was a composer, and he actually composed the music for the original King Kong. And Bender spent most of his life afterwards running the Max Steiner Appreciation Society. So he's very, he went from UFOs to music and left the whole subject behind. And when he did leave it behind, his health returned. He went totally back to normal again. And we find this in a lot of UFO cases involving the Men in Black, which again I'll come to later, where people start to fall sick when they've been in the presence of the Men in Black. There's one of my old girlfriends. That's actually a really good piece of artwork done by a friend of mine, and it appears in my Women in Black book. And the Women in Black, the reason I mention this is because it's quite a lesser-known aspect of the subject, but it ties in directly with the Men in Black. And this is sort of a good image of how they look. You've got the sort of pale skin, the long black hair, and the black clothing, which matches identically with the Men in Black. It's just, again, it's one of these phenomena that has kind of gone under the radar because people don't necessarily realize what they're actually seeing. Now, as far as the Women in Black phenomenon is concerned, that really began in 1966. And 1966 was the year in which the Mothman phenomenon began in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Now, for people who aren't aware of the Mothman story, Mothman was this sort of glowing-eyed, humanoid, winged creature that was seen in and around Point Pleasant from the latter part of 66 to the end of 1967. And it was described as about sort of 7 to 8 feet tall, humanoid, large wings, and these fiery red eyes. And at the same time that people were seeing the Mothman, a number of the witnesses to the creature were visited and threatened by not just Men in Black, but by Women in Black as well. And the Women in Black would knock on people's doors and they would pretend to be census takers from the government. That was what most of the people were told. And so they felt, well, we better invite them in. They're from the government. And so the Women in Black would sit down, start asking questions, normal questions, how many people live in the house, what's the average income, that kind of thing. And then they started asking weirder questions. Have you any strange dreams? Have you seen any strange lights in the sky? Anything like this. And then, of course, understandably, people said, why on earth do census takers want to know about my dreams? Arguably, they wouldn't want to know. And just the fact that they kind of looked a bit weird as well, just like Albert Bender's Men in Black, who was sort of pale-faced, and their skin was sort of like plastic, kind of almost like somebody had overdone it with the Botox or something like that. But that's how they looked. They just sort of totally, like a mannequin, is how the skin was described. And so people got this bad vibe from them as soon as they entered the house. Now, one of the people we have to thank for unveiling, if you like, the angle of the Women in Black is, or was, John Keel. That's John on the right. And John wrote the Mothman Prophecies book, which was turned into a hit movie in 2002. That's a good friend of mine. Some of you might have heard of Greg Bishop. Greg's written quite a few different books on UFOs and paranormal phenomena, and that's where they met one day in New York. On several occasions, when he was investigating the Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant, Keel's witnesses were visited by a woman in black who claimed she was Keel's secretary, and she just wanted to collect some more information for John so she could send it to him and he would have a bigger database. And so when some of these witnesses phoned John and said, I've been speaking to your secretary, he said, well, I don't have a secretary. It's just me. I just do it alone. And then when it was just one call, he didn't think too much about it. When he got to like 15 different calls or letters sent to him, all mentioning his secretary, and then he said, well, hang on, I wonder what this woman looks like. And they all described her like that, as a sort of long hair. And in some cases, the witnesses said they felt it looked like a long wig. And it was either like that or it was in bangs, so it just came kind of, right around her face. And Keel recognised that this was a pattern that wasn't just occurring in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, but actually all across the United States, where there was UFO activity and people were being silenced, that what we had was a situation where the men in black and the women in black were turning up. And Keel put together quite a large database of material in relation to all this. That's a statue of the Mothman in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and I'm on the left, by the way. And that's a cool statue. It's made out of stainless steel, and it was made by a local man who, however he made it, I don't know, but it sort of stands on that sign which tells the history. And if you ever get a chance to go to the Mothman Festival, which is held every September, it's a really good conference because it's kind of like a county fair because everything's outside and they shut down all the downtown streets. And typically there's an audience of about 10 to 12,000. And everybody just kind of hangs out and has a good time. You can buy moth burgers and moth beer and all sorts of stuff. And, but I can tell you for sure the moth beer tastes just like normal beer. But you can buy, they sell cookies with little red eyes made out of like red jelly or whatever. And so it's pretty cool. And they have, for the young girls, they have like a Miss Mothman pageant and there's bands playing. And so it's, like I said, it's like a good social event. And then, there's various people giving lectures as well. Now, today, it's sort of very much like a positive kind of thing, for the community to all get together and have a good time for the weekend. But back in 66 and 67, when the men in black were roaming around town, it was nothing like that at all. Now, what Keel found was that there was this distinct connection between the Mothman witnesses and the people who got visited by the men in black or the women in black. But the whole thing came to a halt at the height of Keel's research in December 67, when the town's Silver Bridge, as it was called, collapsed into the Ohio River. What you have Point Pleasant, which is in West Virginia, then you've got the Ohio River, then the other side is Ohio. So it's literally right on the border. And in December, one night in December 67, there was a bunch of cars on the Silver Bridge, and it suddenly collapsed into the water, killing dozens of people who drowned in their cars and couldn't get out. And a lot of people, not just in the research community, but also people in the town of Point Pleasant, came to believe that the presence of the Mothman and the men in black was connected to the collapse of the bridge and the deaths of dozens of people. And within the sort of men in black Mothman community, the theories sort of fall into two categories. The idea that either Mothman was some sort of evil entity that caused the events to occur, or that it was sort of like a warning entity that surfaces when dangerous things or bad things are about to happen. Now, what's particularly interesting is that last year there was a spate of Mothman-type sightings all around Chicago, literally dozens and dozens of reports. And this coincided with the stories that you were hearing on the news about how North Korea might be able to develop a nuclear weapon which could potentially reach Chicago. They actually mentioned that in the news. So it's kind of weird, that people should suddenly start associating Mothman with Chicago, and other people started to get prophetic dreams of Chicago and giant mushroom clouds, radioactive mushroom clouds. Now, some of it could have just been anxiety, worry about, are we going to go to war, that kind of thing. But it was weird that it all tied in with Mothman and all tied in with Chicago as well. And thankfully, and fingers crossed, nothing has happened. Maybe the whole thing at Point Pleasant was a one-off and we're just sort of putting pieces together when we shouldn't be. I'm not sure, but it's worth noting that angle of how when disaster occurs, creatures like Mothman, these flying humanoids, turn up. There's one in England, in the southwest of England, that's become known as the Owl Man. And there's one in Washington State which is covered in hair, and it's become known as Bat Squatch, kind of like a cross between a bat and Sasquatch, which I guess is kind of a pretty cool name. But so Bat Squatch is sort of on the West Coast. You have Mothman, Point Pleasant, and you can find them throughout history. You know, if you go back to sort of Greek and Roman history, you have the stories of the harpies and gargoyles. All these flying humanoids have been reported throughout history. And so, again, we have a phenomenon where Point Pleasant, you have a lot of strange activity, the men in black, women in black, Mothman, a lot of UFO sightings, and a strange sort of semi-MIB type character who was seen around town named Indrid Cold, which is kind of a strange name. But he had this sort of permanent weird grin on his face, not kind of like a friendly grin, kind of like an axe murderer's grin, you know, that sort of thing. And people saw him, and he had these hypnotic eyes and this crazy grin. And today that phenomenon still exists. It's known as the grinning man, which is also like a subcategory of the Men in Black mystery as well. So, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of this probably destroys a lot of assumptions that some of you in the audience may have about the Men in Black, thinking, you know, it's from the CIA, it's from the FBI or whatever. But, you know, the reality is, and I always tell people, the most important people in the subject are not the lecturers, the writers, the podcasters or whatever. It's actually the witnesses, because without the witnesses, we don't have anything to go on. So my view is that, you know, when it's the witnesses that are telling this, we have to go where the data goes and not try and pigeonhole it because it doesn't sit well in our belief systems. So as you can see already, a lot of this does sort of cross over in terms of ufology into other phenomena as well. And it gets even weirder. You might wonder what on earth the UFOs and Men in Black have to do with Loch Ness, Scotland. Well, the answer is actually quite a lot. One of the theories for what the Loch Ness monsters might be is a presumed extinct marine reptile called the plesiosaur. And that's how the plesiosaur looked. And, you know, we've got a lot of fossils and things like that to show what they really did look like. That's how most people describe the Loch Ness monster, sort of a long head, a long neck, beak-like head, flippers, and a long, thick tail. There's no evidence, actually, that they could leave the water and ramble around on rocks and whatever, but that's just a painting. But the reason why I mention this is because, number one, there's been a lot of UFO activity at Loch Ness, and there's also been a lot of Men in Black cases as well, and reports. Now, the story I'm going to tell you about involves a guy, named Ted Holliday. And Ted Holliday was somebody who got interested in the whole Loch Ness mystery in the early 1960s. And what he would do, he would take a 2-week vacation every summer from 62 to about 75. And he would basically just kind of go to the Loch for 14 days, hang out there with his cameras and his movie cameras and audio equipment in the hope of seeing something. And he began by assuming that the creatures were something along those lines, a plesiosaur, or something at least very similar to it. But as much more time went on, Holliday began to find or conclude that it didn't seem to be quite that straightforward. He started to get a lot of weird synchronicities. I'm sure everybody knows what a synchronicity is, but if there's a few who don't, it's basically like a meaningful coincidence where something happens and it seems so weird that it couldn't just have been a coincidence. You know, it's like if you think of one of your old school friends from 30 years ago, and then 10 minutes later they phone you and you haven't spoken to them in that 30 years. That's sort of like a synchronicity. And Ted Holliday started to get a lot of very weird synchronicities. On several occasions, he thought he'd seen the Loch Ness monsters. As he got his old camera out and tried to take pictures, the camera jammed. And on a couple of occasions, the pictures came out fogged or just completely blank. And he realized or concluded that there was something much weirder going on. And he came to believe that whatever these creatures were or are, he came to believe that, like Mothman, they were more sort of supernatural based than they were flesh and blood based. And in the early 1970s, he started to dig into this even more. And one of the things that particularly caught Holliday's attention was the fact that one of the world's most famous or infamous occultists, Aleister Crowley, actually had a house at Loch Ness called Boleskine House, which burned down about 2 years ago. And Crowley was someone who was involved in a lot of ancient versions of magic and magical rituals, and he tried to summon up paranormal entities from Loch Ness. And it wasn't long after that that people started to see, to a greater degree, Loch Ness monsters, if you like. And Ted Holliday came to believe that there was a connection between the magical rituals at Loch Ness and the presence of these strange creatures, and of course the presence of Aleister Crowley as well. Well, in 1974, one particular day, Ted Holliday was on the shores of Loch Ness, and he kind of has that feeling we all get from time to time when, you're in the checkout line at the store and you think someone's watching you, you turn around and somebody is watching you, We all have the ability to do that, but nobody really knows why we do it. You just know when somebody's burning into the back of your neck, And Ted Holliday had that experience, and he turned around and he was confronted by this man in black, just sort of staring at him. And Holliday just got this really weird, creepy, malevolent vibe from this man in black. And he sort of backed away. The whole atmosphere changed. It's like literally the sky changed. The sky went dark, and he kind of got chills. And he started to back away. He literally sort of walked back up the hill like this, watching him all the time. And the man in black did not move. Then suddenly, Holliday heard this sort of swish past his ear, like a sudden blow of the wind. And when he sort of looked around, and when he looked back, the man in black was gone. But there was clearly nowhere to go because it was just an open stretch of the beach. And so Holliday just basically sort of chalked it up to yet another weird experience. Now, as I said, every summer he would take the same 2 weeks off and go to Loch Ness. Now, the following year, he was actually down on the beach in the very same stretch, 365 days to the exact date of when he saw the man in black the previous year. And he suddenly had a very serious heart attack. And when the ambulance guys arrived and stretchered him away to take him to the hospital, he realized that the stretcher took him right across the patch where the man in black was standing 365 days, 1 year earlier. And Ted Holliday then sort of really backed away from the subject in the same way that Albert Bender did. And he never really got back into it to the enthusiastic degree that he used to. And he actually died young in 79 for another heart attack. And some researchers think that this whole thing with the Men in Black mystery and Ted Holliday, Aleister Crowley, the Loch Ness Monster presence, the Men in Black, a lot of people believe that somehow that it sort of, lessened Ted Holliday's lifespan. And it's one of the more sinister and strange stories that kind of, again, link the Men in Black not just with UFOs, but with, again, paranormal phenomena. And as I said, there have been a number of significant Men in Black encounters at Loch Ness. Ironically, the first time I went to Loch Ness was in 1971, and that was the year in which there was actually a wave of UFO activity at the Loch. I mean, I was only a little kid then, but so I didn't see anything, but it was kind of intriguing to go to Loch Ness at the time when there was this wave of UFO activity going on. Now, people often ask me about the Men in Black. Are the sightings still going on to this day? Well, the answer is yes, they are. I mentioned at the beginning how, when you write books on a particular subject, you get feedback from the readers, and I get a lot of feedback from people who've seen the Men in Black. Now, I would say probably 60 to 70% of all the people who share their stories, they're talking about cases that occurred maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago. And one of the things you find is when people have been terrorized and threatened by the Men in Black, they really do stay quiet for a very, very long time, sometimes literally decades. But in excuse me, but in terms of the remaining sort of 30 to 40%, those cases involve present-day ones. The most recent one that I have is from November of last year. And for last year alone, I've probably got 5 or 6 cases, and that's sort of typically the amount I get every year. But the Men in Black still look, and the women in black still look how they did back in the 60s, with the guys, the fedora hats, the black suits, skinny black tie, white shirt, and the women sort of a black business suit, and what looks sort of like a wig, but in a bang style. So nothing has really changed. And even in some cases today, they still are described as driving the old black cars. You know, they sort of look like they've stepped out of a 1950s gangster movie, you know, or something like that. So that in itself is intriguing, that the phenomenon is still going ahead. But what's sort of weird and baffling is the fact that it hasn't changed. You know, they've made no attempt to upgrade themselves in terms of the fashion. And that's one of the things as to why people remember them, because they stand out so much. You would imagine, and I'll explain later as to why I think they still wear the black outfits, but the fact is that they still do look as if they walked out of the 1950s. That's why people remember them, because 30, 40 years later, they still remember this creepy guy who turned up and whose clothing looked totally out of time. And of course, you know, our fashions change very, very quickly, to the point where, you know, you really notice someone who's sort of in a different fashion. I mean, it's kind of like if you go back to the 80s or something like Miami Vice, you know, Crockett and Tubbs, you know, sort of jackets with the sleeves rolled up and pink T-shirts. I mean, you'd fall around laughing if you saw somebody like that today, you know. But that's like with the Men in Black. They stand out because they don't basically sit in or fit in, if you like, with our society. But in terms of some of these modern cases, this is one I'll talk about right now. This is a MUFON researcher named Denise Stoner, and Denise lives in Florida, and she's done a lot of good UFO investigations, and as a result of her investigations, she's also received visits, not from the Men in Black, but from the women in black. And this picture I'll show you now was actually sort of dictated by Denise to the artist to get it as close as possible. And that's what she looked like. She actually had like black, solid eyes, which are sort of typical of the phenomenon of the black-eyed children. But this was not a girl. It was, you know, sort of 5'5", 5'6", clearly not a child. And again, you can see sort of the bang-style hair, the pointed chin. Very pointed chin is what is often described in both the Men in Black and the women in black. And she said they were wearing this sort of really weird, sort of almost like a centuries-old outfit, like a black outfit with sleeves, grey sleeves, and straps over the top. And they knocked on the door incessantly, like 5 or 6 times, and Denise's daughter went to the door and looked through the spy hole and said, "Mom, there's 2 strange women outside the door." And they looked identical, just 2 of them. They both had the same hair, the same outfit, the same eyes. And Denise obviously didn't want to open the door. But what was weird, so they backed away, but what was weird was that they kind of vanished almost impossibly quickly, which is something which time and again gets reported in MIB cases. It's almost as if they've just sort of, you know, dematerialized like that, rather than just sort of walk down the driveway and et cetera, et cetera. But Denise had a lot of weird stuff going on at the same time. A guy turned up at her house one day claiming to be working for the local city government and said, "Oh, you know, we've got a new alarm for you for your house." And said, can I come in and install it? And she's like, "Well, I've never heard anything like this before." She let him in, and he didn't seem to know anything about house alarms at all. And she, again, got this weird vibe from him and asked him to leave. And And you find that a lot, that people who get visited by the men in black, they sometimes have follow-up things like this, where a strange person will turn up, ask weird questions, or they'll wake up in the middle of the night because the phone's ringing. And like most people, if the phone's ringing in the middle of the night, you think it's somebody with bad news. So people tend to answer the phones. But very often there's just this weird electronic screeching going down the line, which again sort of freaks people out at 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning. But it's sort of like a residual hangover from the original sighting, where the women in black and the men in black leave, but it's some sort of paranormal issue hovering behind, remaining behind, which acts as a magnet for all this other material to come in. Now, with the history of who the men in black are in terms of their activities and how the phenomenon began, we've sort of gone from 1909 right through to the present day with Denise's case, and which sort of brings us to the issue of who or what the men in black and the women in black actually are. Now, as I said, if you base all your kind of theories and ideas on the men in black from the movies, arguably you would say, well, they're from the Pentagon or the CIA or the FBI or the DIA or whoever. And what I would say to that question or that angle is that I do think a small percentage of Men in Black reports are caused by government agencies, but they're not the real original Men in Black. What I think's happened, well, certainly through the 50s, when people were visited by government agents who wanted to talk about their UFO experiences, you have to remember back in the 50s and 60s, the average fashion for the guys at that time was suits and ties and fedora hats. And so I think in some cases, there's been like a legitimate mistake where people were visited by genuine government people who happened to dress like the Men in Black, but they weren't the real Men in Black. But there's also interesting enough data to suggest that at times the government has used the Men in Black legend, if you like, as a means to silence people. In other words, I think it's kind of like the penny dropped at some point in the 50s where government agencies said, well, if we want to silence people, why don't we dress like those Men in Black that the UFO research community keeps talking about? So I think what happened was, a significant UFO event would occur and somebody in the office would say, hey guys, it's time to put the black hat on and the suit and tell John Smith not to talk about what he'd seen. But again, they weren't the real Men in Black. They were using the legend of the Men in Black to camouflage their own activities. So that brings us to the angle of who are these weirder, pale, weird-faced men and women. Who are they in terms of the different theories for what they might be? Now, one of the theories is the time traveler angle. That's a friend of mine, Josh Warren. Josh lives in North Carolina, and he has like this little museum where he keeps all different things on display, and that's what you've got there. And Josh has looked into the Men in Black mystery quite deeply, and he theorizes at least, that maybe the Men in Black are time travelers. And as I mentioned, one of the things that really stands out is the clothing. The clothing looks completely out of time, and literally everything about them is out of time. The cars, the clothing, everything. But Josh has noted a few other things as well, that in a number of MIB cases, the MIB ask the witnesses, what time is it? And you might say, well, it's 11:20. But Josh has noted that in the way the question's asked, it's almost as if, what time are we in? Not what time is it, what time are we in? And I mean, if somebody said, what time is it? And you say, well, what year is it? You'd wonder what on earth they were talking about. But there actually are about 14 or 15 cases on record where the MIB have asked this weird question, what time are we in? And so, if you're your average time traveler and you're kind of flitting back and forth from the 40s to the 90s to the 80s, you could understand why they might be sort of confused a little bit. But, of course, all this is dictated by whether or not time travel is actually possible. It's kind of like I said to Josh, I mean, why didn't they sort of upgrade their black Cadillacs to DeLoreans, and which would be far more sort of inclined with time-traveling cars. But, it's one of these situations where you can make a theory, certainly, that they are time travelers when you put out all the different patterns together. Whether or not they are, I don't know, but people have sort of theorized that, well, what if the entire UFO phenomenon is they're time travelers, not aliens, and maybe the Men in Black are sort of the police. They police the future, the present, and the past to ensure that timelines don't get mixed and problems don't occur, and you don't kill your grandmother before you're born, and then you don't cease to exist. So it's an interesting theory, an interesting concept. Probably the most controversial, well, certainly without the most controversial theory, is the idea that they are quite literally demonic. A number of people within ufology do actually think that's the case. Now, personally, I don't go with the demonic angle, but I think it's important for me to share all the theories. I don't think I should be standing here censoring the data. I think it's the right thing to do, responsible thing to do, is put it all out for you to hear. And this is a guy named Ray Boucher. Ray has an interesting background. As well as being a priest, he's also a former state director for MUFON, and he was the state director for Nebraska throughout the 1980s. And Ray believes that there is a genuine UFO phenomenon, but he believes it's literally demonic. Now, my personal view is that probably a lot of things that sort of centuries ago, even thousands of years ago, which were perceived as being demons, may actually be some of the sort of paranormal entities that we see today, whether something like Mothman or the Men in Black, but it's the interpretation of the people of that particular era or the country or the culture. But it's an interesting concept, the idea that sort of pushes it also further down a sort of a paranormal pathway. Now, one of the strangest angles that I've personally investigated is the fact that there are a number of UFO witnesses, MIB witnesses, who've had no involvement in the UFO subject at all. They've never seen a UFO, never had an alien abduction, but they've been visited by the Men in Black. And in these particular cases, it occurred literally some cases within hours or perhaps a day or two after they'd been using Ouija boards. I have no real way to explain how all that might be, other than to say that, people who use Ouija boards, the goal is to sort of open a doorway or a portal to entities on the other side. So one of the theories is that the Ouija board itself acts as sort of the vessel to open the doorway. That's the only way I can kind of think of to explain how the Men in Black and the Women in Black might suddenly turn up in that situation, because somebody has literally kind of unlocked the key to the door, so to speak, and they come through. Now, the big difference is that most cases, the Men in Black turn up on the doorstep. In the Ouija board cases, it's usually people wake up in the early hours of the morning, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., and find themselves either paralyzed or semi-paralyzed. It's called sleep paralysis. And most people at some point get it in their lives, even if it's just once or twice. And you basically sort of wake up, you can't move, and you feel there's this threatening thing coming up the corridor towards the bedroom, or already in the bedroom, sort of looming over. And the closer it gets, the harder it is to sort of move. And then suddenly you wake up and the thing's gone. That's how most of the Men in Black cases in relation to Ouija boards occur. And again, I'd be sort of selling you short if I didn't talk about these theories, because, again, whatever people think about them, it's still an important part of the Men in Black mystery. Now, we've also got vampire parallels, and I should stress, I don't believe in the existence of, some old guy with fangs and a cloak and, draining people of blood, but there actually are some really interesting vampire parallels with the Men in Black mystery. One of them being that you would imagine if somebody has seen a UFO and the MIB turn up, you would think, they'd kind of kick the door down and find a way in and slam you against the door or the wall and threaten you. That's actually not what they do at all. People have said, there's a knock on the door late at night, and if you get a knock on the door at 12 o'clock, 11 o'clock, you're not going to open the door. If you look through the spy hole and you sort of see 3 creepy, skinny, pale-faced guys in black suits, you might even call the police. But people don't do that. They say they suddenly feel like their mind's been taken over, like as if they're somehow hypnotized, and they're compelled to open the door. And the men in black wait until they're invited to come in. And that kind of invitation actually ties in with the old legends of vampires, that they can't cross the threshold until you invite them in. It's the same with the men in black. They don't force their way in. They just kind of stand there waiting for you to give them the okay. So I sometimes wonder if some of these old legends of vampires draining people of blood might actually be based on early reports of genuine MIB cases. I mean, for example, the picture I showed at the very beginning of the horses and the carriage and all black and the guy in a black cloak on top of the carriage, that kind of provokes vampire-type imagery. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of these cases have sort of helped the vampire legend, if you like, develop. Now, another vampire parallel is the fact that when the men in black are finally in the house and the person feels hypnotized and they sit down and then the men in black start to threaten them, people have said they've started to feel ill, kind of like Albert Bender. They felt clammy and cold. The hair starts to stand up on their arms, not just because they're frightened by what's going on, but a lot of people have said they felt as if the men in black was sort of literally draining them of their life force. Now, and again, like a vampire parallel, in the old stories, the vampires bite you on the neck and drain your blood. In this case, it's like a psychic vampire where, we've all met somebody at some point who's totally negative, and you talk with them for about an hour, and you're exhausted, because that kind of negativity bleeds into you as well. And but it's more severe than that. People literally do feel their sort of life force is being drained. One witness described it to me as how a diabetic might feel if, they'd missed breakfast, they'd missed lunch, and it was 8 o'clock at night, and they started to get the shakes and cold, and they'd got to eat, like right now. And that's how people have felt. They felt they were, sort of sinking into the couch almost, and they hadn't got the energy to stand up. And in those cases, you always have the one man in black issuing the threats, and the other one is just penetrating with his eyes into the witness, as if he's the one who's kind of just pulling the energy or the life force from them. So again, I want to stress, I don't believe in the existence of literal vampires, but I do think there could well be something to the idea that vampire phenomena has been born out of some of these MIB-type cases. And when you get stories over and over again of things like the black-eyed children, where they need to be invited into the house as well, and the Hat Man and the shadow people, all of these things, I think, are somehow interconnected. Now, I mentioned how people like Ted Holliday had weird synchronicities in relation to the Men in Black. And that's actually happened to me as well, and I'll show you 2 examples. Now, I don't usually spend my time lurking around graveyards, but I do occasionally. The reason why I put that picture up there is because it was taken in 2013, and whenever my dad comes over from England, he usually comes about once a year. After about sort of 18 years, it becomes a task to try and find new things to do, to take him. But he likes sort of history, and so I thought what I would do, I'd take him to the graves, which are in Dallas, of the famous gangsters, Bonnie and Clyde. I'm sure most people have heard of Bonnie and Clyde. Well, they're buried in, they're actually in separate cemeteries in Dallas, but that particular cemetery is where Clyde Barrow is buried. And I said to my dad, I'll take you over there. You can see the gravestones and get some pictures. Now, it's important to note that the morning, we went out in the afternoon, the morning, I had to do finish an article on the Men in Black. That's an sort of important aspect of it. So we went out there, and I said, that's Clyde Barrow's grave. And next to Clyde's grave is his brother, who was also killed in the shootout. And his name was Marvin Ivan Barrow. And that's his gravestone, which is like Emma. And so that's like, people say, well, that's just coincidence. But I get so many weird coincidences like that, and it's kind of like, what are the chances of writing an article in the morning on the Men in Black, and then in the afternoon, there's the gravestone, MIB, even with like the periods between, as they have in the movies. And it's actually not as big as it looks. It's only about maybe the size of the laptop. And I thought, should I do a bit of grave robbing or not? It would look good on the wall, but no. I'll leave it where it is. That's only going to make things worse, But it is kind of a cool little gravestone, and things like that happen all the time in relation to the Men in Black. I'll give you another one. If you can see that picture, you can see it's a framed letter, and the glass is all broken and shattered. Well, in 2015, when I was putting the final touches to my 2015 Men in Black book, the one I put up on the screen earlier, I'd just finishing up the Word document, and I was going to send it to my agent, Lisa, so she could review it and edit it and so on. And it was just normal, regular, sunny day, no dark clouds, no thunder, nothing ominous or anything like that. And so I closed the document down, was just about to attach it to an email to send to Lisa, and I heard a thump coming from one of the rooms in my apartment. And I thought, well, what was that? And I finally went into the bedroom, and what it was, this particular framed picture or letter had fallen off the wall, and the glass had shattered on the floor, so I had to clean it all up. But that letter is actually a framed letter written by Albert Bender, the guy who kicked it all off in '53, in the early 50s. So, and actually somebody gave me some original copies of his letters, so I thought it'd be cool to frame one of them. But what happened, as I said, was it fell off the wall, shattered on the ground, right at the same time as I was just closing down the Word document and finishing up the Men in Black book. And the timing of that was sort of really weird and almost kind of creepy. It's almost like something invisible is sort of right behind you, and doing who knows what. But that's just two examples of many that relate to the whole angle of the Men in Black and synchronicities. And people often ask me, have I ever been threatened by them? Well, I haven't been threatened, but I actually have a couple of occasions where, when I was at the height of doing research and writing, that I started to get some of these early hours of the morning phone calls. And on one occasion, it rang about 2:30, 3 a.m., and I looked at the caller ID, and it was actually my own phone number. It's kind of like that old movie, where the cop says, the call's coming from inside the house, or whatever that old film was, And the one I mean, anyway. And that was kind of really weird as well. It's like, how could your own phone number kind of turn up, on the screen when it was actually an incoming call, which was odd. And just as another kind of paranormal aside, if you like, the last three numbers of my phone number are 666. So which I was like, oh no. So, it is, joking aside, I think for me, I've never really been threatened as such, because I kind of more take like a detached approach, and I try not to get obsessed by it, which is people like Albert Bender and Ted Holliday did get really obsessed, where there was no social life, there was nothing other than 24/7. And if people like to do it that way, that's fine, But I think with something like the Men in Black, which is sinister enough to start with, I think this kind of phenomena actually gets its grips into people, and particularly people who may be a little bit sort of insecure, not too sure of themselves, they're the easiest to manipulate. And I think this phenomenon does manipulate people and can. And it's almost as if it seems to know and follow people who are investigating the phenomenon. I mean, like maybe the Synchronicities and John Keel, he had a lot of weird synchronicities as well in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Now, the most modern example of sort of a spin-off of the whole Men in Black mystery is the issue of the Slender Man, which some of you may have heard of. The Slender Man phenomenon is sort of relatively new, but that's the new book I've got out right now called The Slender Man Mysteries. As you can see, the Slender Man, sort of black suit, white shirt, black tie, and he has a completely faceless face. There's no eyes, no nose, no mouth, no ears, just sort of vague little shadows where they should be. Now, the Slender Man began as an internet contest in 2009 where people were invited to a website called Something Awful to come up with the creepiest, weirdest character for the internet era. It was basically kind of like an internet era equivalent of Freddy Krueger mixed with Michael Myers, and et cetera, sort of like a modern day boogeyman. One of the people who entered this contest was a guy named Eric Knudsen. And Eric Knudsen was the man who came up with the name Slender Man, and also the image of the black suit, a 7 to 9 foot tall, skinny humanoid figure with these weird tentacles coming out of its back, which you can see there as well, sort of like octopus-type tentacles. So it was like a really kind of strange and sinister imagery. And that was the case, the example that really won the contest. Everything else, was sort of by the wayside. Within weeks of the Slender Man phenomenon taking off, there were chat rooms, forums, Wikipedia pages, all sorts of different things going on. People were writing their own Kindle novels about the Slender Man. And there was an extremely popular show online called Marble Hornets, which is like it's a series, an ongoing series. And it's like one of these found footage movies you see where, it begins with somebody finding a camera and there's a bunch of footage on there of something that happened, and the people in the movie follow the story. And so within weeks, the Slender Man phenomenon went from being just this sort of fairly obscure thing that began on the internet in 2009, the summer of 2009, to where it became a literal phenomenon. And you had kids, teenagers all around the world following and fixating and obsessing on the Slender Man, literally hundreds of thousands. For example, today, if you just go to Google and type in the word Slender Man, you get more than 7 million results. That's actually how sort of popular this whole thing has become. But within about 4 or 5 months of people talking about the Slender Man, dreaming about it, having nightmares, obsessing, writing novels, writing little short stories, forums, chat rooms, people then started to say they'd seen the Slender Man in the real world. They'd seen him, for example, not unlike some of the Men in Black reports, sort of looming over people in the bed. And again, so the black suit, the white shirt, the black tie, and the faceless face. And a lot of people describe that kind of situation where, again, they're in bed, not able to move properly, and the Slender Man is sort of looming over them. And some of these cases, they just might be nightmares, because people have just overdosed on too much on the Slender Man. But a lot of people have when I say a lot of people claim now to have seen the Slender Man, it is a lot. We're not talking, a couple of dozen. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds. One of the interesting theories that's been put forward is the idea of thought forms. Has anybody heard of thought forms? Yeah. Okay. Well, the concept of a thought form is actually a Tibetan Buddhist term in its originality. But the idea is that if enough people, like it's sort of like a hive mindset, if enough people focus on something and think about something obsessively and on, it can create a real-world paranormal version of something that began just as a piece of fiction. In other words, We know for sure that the Slender Man, black-suited figure, was created by Eric Knudsen for this contest. There's no doubt about that. But what we're seeing now is a Slender Man in the real world. And if you've got hundreds of thousands of people all thinking about it, all obsessing about it, the theory is then suddenly what exists in the human imagination then strides out of the imagination into the real world. And the stronger it gets, the more self-aware it becomes and the more physical it becomes, rather than at the start when it's sort of shadowy and you can just see it out the corner of your eye. Then it becomes more and more substantial. And then it reaches a danger point when it becomes so self-aware, it then turns the tables on the creator because it doesn't want to run the risk of being deconstructed. And according to the old teachings, the best way to deconstruct a thought form is to try and figure it in your mind and disintegrating it. And if everybody was to do that, it might go away. But of course, the creature doesn't want that to happen. And so it turns the tables on the creator. And that potentially would explain why there's been this sudden, since 2010, wave of activity of people seeing the Slender Man. Now, really up until 2014, really the only people who'd heard of the Slender Man were people who were interested in the subject. But that changed in May 2014 when two young girls in Waukesha, Wisconsin, attacked a former friend of theirs and stabbed her 19 times in the name of the Slender Man. Basically, in their own words, they said that they wanted to sacrifice her so they could become the Slender Man's proxy. That was the wording they used. And the idea was they were going to live with the Slender Man in this sort of creepy mansion in the woods not too far from where the attack occurred, which was in a small park in Waukesha. And it was a story that reached not just local or national news, but worldwide news. It was in the major UK newspapers, Australia, Europe, all over the place. And this story really, again, sort of put the Slender Man angle even further into the public domain. And those two girls were sentenced just not long ago, and although they're not in prison, they're basically behind closed doors now till they'll be well into middle age. But they were fully believing in the existence of the Slender Man. Now, for the court, it was a situation of, well, what's the crime, etc., etc. Let's get psychiatrists in to speak to them. So they certainly weren't focusing at all on the idea of a thought form come to life, because that's not the job of the court to cover things like that. But what is interesting, a lot of people don't know this, but Waukesha, where the attack occurred in 2014, has been the site of a number of other cases, very, very similar, dating back to the early 1920s. For example, in 1921, the body of a young boy was unfortunately found in a pool in Waukesha. And nobody knew who he was. He was actually buried there without a name, like an unknown grave. Excuse me. And he was known or nicknamed by the police and the media as Little Lord Fauntleroy, which is based on a story of this little boy who lives in a rich family. And the young boy who was killed, he was wearing expensive clothes, so they thought he came from a rich family, even though they couldn't identify him, so that's why he had that name. But what's interesting is that a psychic looked into the angle of his death and said that she saw somebody carrying his body through the woods, and he was described as being tall, skinny, and dressed in a black suit, which, when you look at the parallels, this is 1921, and then you sort of look at the parallels in 2014. Another case, again, one of many, a guy named Mike Huberty, who I interviewed for the book. Mike saw this sort of 8-foot-tall, spindly, shadowy humanoid in a Waukesha woods about 2 miles from where the attack by the two girls occurred. Their attack was 2014. Mike's sighting was 1995. So, you have numerous examples of weird stuff that predate the official creation, if you like, of the Slender Man. But what's interesting is throughout the world you can find sort of archetypes that are similar to the Slender Man. Germany has one called Der Grossmann, which again is like the Slender Man. And you can find them in all different cultures as well. So I think that although Eric Knudsen created the Slender Man, I think this sort of archetypal imagery of a dangerous figure in a black suit kind of is in everybody's subconscious. And I think that's why things like the Men in Black, the Women in Black, the Slender Man, all of these things which are clearly somehow interlinked, I think the angle of the black suit and why they wear them is because it creates that sort of air of authority and intimidation for some people, and it works on them. And I think you add to that the ability of these entities to control people's minds, to manipulate them, possibly in a very strange way to feed on them even. And what we have is a phenomenon that has been with us for a very, very long time, and which seems to impact on not just UFOs, but other aspects of the paranormal. Like I said, Ouija boards, Loch Ness Monster, Mothman. All of these things seem to be somehow interlinked in ways we don't really understand. And, you know, if we look at the UFO phenomenon, certainly back in the 40s and 50s, people were just looking at it from a perspective of nuts and bolts UFOs coming from that star, from that planet, and that was it. You know, it was somebody else's equivalent of NASA. And I don't dispute, you know, there is a real UFO phenomenon, but I think we need to sort of broaden our horizons a little bit to try and figure out why there seems to be this crossover between the paranormal and the supernatural, even the occult, and the UFO phenomenon. And if it was just nuts and bolts UFOs, why all the weird synchronicities that even sort of plague people like me who's just writing about the subject, never mind, you know, not being visited, so to speak. So I think we're dealing with something where there are a lot of pre-existing perceptions as to what the Men in Black are, being the government. But unless, you know, the government employs, you know, hundreds of pale-faced, skinny little guys in black suits, which I don't believe they do, you know, we cannot put this at the foot of the government or any government. It's much, much weirder. And so I think we're dealing with something, as I said, very old, which has been given various names and titles over the centuries, which has never really gone away. But I think the term Man in Black is probably likely to stay. I don't think that's going to go away. I think that's always going to be with us. And, you know, people often say to me, what should I do if I see a Man in Black? You know, after I've had a UFO encounter. Well, it's very easy to say what you should do. You know, if you hear a knock on the front door, don't let them in. But that's the problem. People do let them in. Almost always they let them in. And as I said, it's like as if their mind has been controlled. So my advice, if any of you have had an encounter or you do, just try and stay as far away as possible. Don't let them in if you can help it. Don't get too close to them because of this angle of like the sort of the supernatural draining of energy and people falling sick like Albert Bender. And although, you know, the phenomenon has been sort of, I don't want to say dumbed down by Hollywood, but Hollywood's put more of an entertainment angle on it. But the reality is that the genuine phenomenon is much more disturbing than most people probably could ever think until you start to look into it. So I'll just sort of thank everybody for listening and just sort of, again, to demonstrate that, yes, there's a UFO phenomenon, a real phenomenon, which impacts on us and comes from somewhere else. There is this other aspect that I think ufology should embrace further and not just focus on Area 51 or Roswell or this, but to look and realize that we are dealing with something that is so strange that in many respects it takes things outside of ufology as well. Or it suggests that maybe we should kind of reinvent aspects of ufology to incorporate a lot of this stuff that so many people just view it as, oh, this is just fringe, crazy stuff, you know, but it actually isn't. And I think there's nothing wrong with having belief systems, but I think if you have a belief system to the point where you deny or ignore this alternative data, I think to do that would be disastrous, and it would be a shame as well not to share everything with everybody. And I think sometimes ufology as a field can learn from that, because very often it is sort of little groups and cliques and belief systems, and we all have belief systems. Nothing wrong with that, but I think the Men in Black mystery is one of those which, more than any other, helps us to realize that reality isn't not necessarily what it seems to be. So I guess I'll just close by saying, if you hear knock on the door late at night, and unless it's sort of your aunt, uncle, or whoever, don't let them in, and don't fall foul of them, and try and just put like a mental barrier up to keep them at bay. And if anybody's got any questions, I'll be at my table for the rest of the afternoon. So thanks for listening to my weird stuff on all these strange creatures. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you.